Coming up. Will it happen? I don't know. If it does, there will be a bigger question. Can the Republicans keep those votes? And that question and how it gets answered would be one of the biggest political developments of the last 100 years. And everyone would be the better for it because no party should take its voters for granted. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? I've talked in prior episodes about the fact that in 2016, for the first time in the presidential election, I added fear of our First Amendment free speech rights being severely restricted to the reasons why I voted. With each new episode of infringement of free speech on college campuses, I recognize that my fears were justified, and I've talked before about how Canada has degenerated even further in that respect. Well, now we have more evidence that north of the border the concept of free speech is disappearing. Incredibly, the Court of Appeal in Quebec, the highest court in that province, has upheld the decision of the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal ordering that a comedian pay a disabled person $35,000 for mocking him with a joke. The Human Rights Tribunal concluded that the comedian's comments, quote, exceeded the limits of what a reasonable person must tolerate in the name of freedom of expression, close quote. The tribunal even ordered that the comedian must pay an additional $7,000 to the disabled person's mother. Thankfully, the court at least overturned that absurd part of the decision. Were the comedian's jokes offensive? Absolutely. At the time he was making the jokes, the disabled person was a minor and had appeared on television singing the Canadian national anthem at a Montreal Canadiens home game. He's afflicted with the disability Treacher-Collins syndrome, which results in underdeveloped cheekbones and jaw. The comedian mocked him in comedy sets. The disabled minor was not in the audience, but he was known for singing the national anthem. Per the Montreal Gazette, in coverage on November 29, the comedian had poked fun at the disabled singer's illness and singing ability, noting that he had said he had defended his singing ability because he thought he was fatally ill, but later recognized he was only, quote, ugly, close quote. The appellate panel voted 2-1 to uphold the fine. The comedian, Mike Ward, has said that he will not pay the fine and intends to appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada. Now is the time when I'll mention what every article covering decisions like this should mention. Free speech protections are not needed for innocuous speech. You're not going to be fined or prosecuted for saying you like puppies or telling a dad joke designed for kids. It's the offensive speech that needs protection. We can all agree that it was at minimum rude and at maximum piggish, crude, and insensitive for Mike Ward to make fun of the illness of a person with a disability. But we should also be able to agree that allowing government bodies to impose fines on persons for such crude and insensitive statements, which no one is forced to hear, is a recipe for stifling creativity and a dangerous expansion of government power over human rights. It also threatens to turn countries like Canada into a modern-day iteration of the dystopian world which was the setting of the movie Demolition Man, where cursing produces instantaneous fines and the culture is so sanitized that the only music deemed sufficiently inoffensive consists of commercial jingles. Most notably, the grunge rock anthem, I Wish I Were an Oscar Mayer Wiener. Oh, Canada, where are you going? Next topic. college admissions and Joe Biden. Something occurred to me the other day. I was watching the news coverage about the college admissions scandal and speculation about potential imprisonment that Hollywood star Lori Loughlin, Aunt Becky of Full House fame, could face if convicted of the charges leveled on her and her husband for allegedly fraudulently obtaining admission for their daughter to the University of Southern California. Much of the public, me included, has been disgusted by the conduct which was revealed in the college admissions scandals investigation. Wealthy individuals fraudulently claiming that their kids were successful high school athletes and working with college administrators and other employees essentially operating as con men to game the system, including in some instances fraudulently obtaining inflated college admission test scores. As a parent who has watched my kids suffer the stress and worry over whether their grades and test scores and other high school achievements were going to be enough to get them into their college of choice, and I suffered right along with them, I'm disgusted by the conduct of these wealthy and in some cases famous parents, apparently concluding that competition is for the little guy. We're just too well-heeled and too famous to be forced to suffer the indignity of potentially losing out to some middle-class kid from flyover country. So we'll just lie and cheat our way in. We'll never get caught, and if we do get caught, surely they'll just give us a slap on the wrist. After all, prison is for that little guy. Frankly, this unprecedented investigation and prosecution is long overdue. Have you noticed that the media hasn't gone to bat for these parents, including their fellow member of the television family, Lori Loughlin? Granted, they haven't attacked her with the ferocity they tend to reserve for people who are outside of the media family, so to speak, or who are on the wrong side of the political spectrum, but they haven't defended her either. Maybe they're just too aware of the disgust felt by so many of the public because so much of the public has gone through this stress and worry about whether their kids would get into the college they wanted. So maybe the news media is sort of begrudgingly critical of Lori Loughlin, so begrudgingly that they don't see the obvious connection to national politics. I'm so used to the national news media missing the obvious that it probably shouldn't surprise me that they miss the obvious here. What obvious thing am I talking about? I'm talking about the Burisma scandal with Joe and Hunter Biden. I recently talked to an extremely intelligent, extremely qualified former corporate executive who has taken a step away from the rat race of the full-time corporate existence and instead is taking part in corporate life simply through membership on the boards of directors of a couple of large companies. She noted that she might be interested in more such memberships, but she said they're very much in demand and extremely hard to come by. And then it struck me. This very successful woman, who'd risen through the ranks of some of the largest corporations in the world, who was an extremely successful businesswoman by any measurement, was in essentially the same spot as that middle-class kid in flyover country who may not have gotten into the college of his choice because the slot was taken by Lori Loughlin or one of the other alleged parental cons trying to cheat and bribe their kids' way into college. Sure, there's nothing to indicate that any particular corporate board of directors slots that this individual is looking for were taken by people who didn't actually subject themselves to a merit-based evaluation. But I'm talking about the question more broadly. Hunter Biden was awarded a board of directors slot of a company, Burisma, about which he had little to no knowledge of their business, oil and gas, little to no knowledge of the country in which it was located, Ukraine, no fluency at all in the language of Ukraine, and as far as we can tell, he possesses no outstanding level of talent at anything. And for this he was paid the sum of $50,000 to $83,000 per month, an amount which some studies have indicated was up to 12 times the norm for a company the size of Burisma. But I've talked about that before, so why am I talking about it again? Because Joe Biden is in this instance a much bigger version of the parents who've been accused, and many have pled guilty, of cheating their kids' way into college. Just as cons like what got those kids into USC cause parents to conclude that the college admission system is rigged, the fact that Hunter Biden, known primarily as the drug-addicted son of a successful politician, was named to the board of directors of a large company and dramatically overpaid for that position, should cause the public to conclude that the political system is rigged, and for companies as apparently ethically challenged as Burisma, the corporate governance system may be rigged as well. That should be deeply disturbing to everyone, and it should be incredibly interesting to the press and political commentators. The fact that, to my knowledge, no one else has picked up on it is evidence that it includes subjects the press is actually reluctant to cover. They're covering the Lori Loughlin angle, but I think they're doing it primarily because of the public's interest in the potential imprisonment of a Hollywood star. I doubt that in their hearts they feel much of the revulsion that large segments of the public feel. And as to the Biden corruption, the bulk of the media, because they lean left, refuses to cover it and simply passes it off as allegations which have been disproven, which is not true. And in the process, an interesting angle connecting two hot news topics is ignored. Just the latest evidence of how far the press has fallen in America. Next topic. Are we at a watershed moment in party politics? We talked previously about the fact that polling shows that when asked whether the media is trying to advance impeachment against President Trump with its coverage rather than providing balanced coverage, a greater percentage of African Americans than whites believe that the media is using the impeachment to get President Trump. And an even higher percentage of non-black minorities believe that. I've said for quite some time that President Trump will receive more African American male votes than expected and more Hispanic votes than expected. I recently raised the possibility that the polling regarding the media may indicate that an even higher percentage of minorities than I had predicted would end up supporting the president. Well, now there's more polling out regarding minority support for Trump. Approval of President Trump was at 34.5% among registered black voters in the most recent Emerson poll. The NPR PBS NewsHour Marist poll showed non-white adults with 33% approval for Trump, and Rasmussen showed 34% approval of Trump among likely black voters. Now, I recognize that approval in a poll doesn't necessarily translate to votes at the ballot box. But I can't imagine anyone asserting that 33 to 34.5% approval for Trump among African American voters is anything other than a stunning development. Remember, exit polling showed that Trump only received 8% of the African American vote in 2016. If in fact he's in line to receive anything even remotely close to those approval numbers in an actual vote in 2020, that would be an occurrence so stunning it would represent one of the biggest political developments in the history of the country. For how many decades have Republicans said they want to break into the African American voter bloc? And for how many decades have those efforts failed? Starting from the first episodes of this podcast, I've talked about identity politics in an analogy to a corporate retail market. I asked, what if you were part of a company that sold products or services, and a portion of your customer base which was significant in numbers and loyal, but which was hard to satisfy because it had problems which were difficult to solve? I said it would be so much easier to keep that part of your customer base if, rather than undertaking the difficult effort of trying to solve those customers' problems with your products and services, you were instead able to convince them that your only major competitor literally hated them. You wouldn't have to worry that they'd ever go to your competitor because you'd convince them that it hated them. You wouldn't have to solve those customers' problems, and you could instead focus on other customers. That is, in essence, the position in which the Democratic Party has placed itself with black voters. and that's the reason it fights so hard against any Republican who's black or who reaches out to black voters. And until President Trump, few Republicans who weren't black have aggressively reached out to black voters. But Trump has been the exception, and that outreach, combined with undeniable economic success that has lifted the black populace, may now be bearing fruit. As we think about the youth of our country and what they face, I believe most people think about two things that are negative and one that's positive. The negative things are, first, technology, including artificial intelligence, is expected to change the workplace so fast and so extensively that the future of employment seems almost impossible to figure out, and the potential for future massive shortages of jobs seems real. Second, the degree to which the country split along party lines is extreme, perhaps matched in modern times only by the split brought on by the Vietnam War in the late 1960s through early 1970s. And the positive note is that in terms of overall wealth, America has risen to previously unheard of heights. We've heard about those three things seemingly endlessly, and with regard to the unheard of heights of national wealth, discussions almost always come with some mention of the very unequal distribution of that wealth. So even there, the great wealth of the country is often characterized as a negative. What is there for youth to be excited about? Well, I'm not at the point of predicting that unheard of numbers of minorities will vote for President Trump. I'm not at the point of predicting that the Republican Party has finally achieved that seemingly unreachable goal of making huge inroads into the minority voting population. In the end, I'm very careful about my predictions. However, I can comfortably say that we are beginning to see evidence that the minority vote for President Trump may be more than just surprisingly high. After all, I've been saying for a very long time that it will be surprisingly high. If we continue to see this evidence, we may be in for an election development that would be a sea change, a watershed moment in the political history of America. And that wouldn't be just great for Republicans. It wouldn't be just great for America as a whole. It would also be great for minority Americans and for young Americans. For one thing, I would expect you could almost hear a collective gasp from Democratic Party leadership nationwide if it were to happen. For the first time in a long time, they wouldn't be able to rest on the belief that minority Americans would buy into the idea that Republicans hate them. Democrats would actually have to deliver. And in the end, forcing the parties to produce results would be good for all Americans. And it's not just the need for the parties to deliver results that would be good for young Americans. I sometimes wonder what young Americans believe are the defining national moments associated with their generation. They don't have World War II to point to, or the Vietnam War, or the Cold War. They don't have 9/11 and its aftermath. They don't have a defining national development or event. But you know what? A reconfiguration of the national parties resulting in huge numbers of minorities voting Republican? That would be a defining national moment, a defining event. It would be something you could point to in old age and say, I voted in that election. Will it happen? I don't know. If it does, there will be a bigger question. Can the Republicans keep those votes? And that question and how it gets answered would be one of the biggest political developments of the last 100 years. And everyone would be the better for it, because no party should take its voters for granted. And I try not to take Political Spirit's listeners for granted. I'll be back next week with another episode. Please join me. Be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits and like the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits. And follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. And I'm delighted to announce as well that for the first time, we now have listeners in Vermont. Welcome aboard, and thank you for being a part of Political Spirits. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.